What happens when Donald Trump's economic war ends up uniting two countries he never expected to stand together? A single decision, a brutal 50% tariff on Indian exports, has triggered a chain reaction. Families in India are losing jobs, Canadian factories are delaying investments, and global alliances are starting to fracture. Yet in the middle of this storm, Canada and India are quietly drawing closer, building a new front against America's economic pressure. And the most surprising part? This partnership could reshape the balance of power in ways Washington never saw coming. The shock began in Washington when Trump's administration announced a punishing 50% tariff on Indian goods. Billions of dollars in trade, shrimp, textiles, diamonds, and garments were suddenly strangled. What had been a $212 billion annual exchange between the US and India now stood on the brink of collapse. The effects rippled quickly. Factories closed, workers were sent home, and Indian exporters saw their largest market vanish overnight. For New Delhi, this wasn't just a financial hit, it was a geopolitical earthquake. But the damage didn't stop there. Canada, already wrestling with Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, suddenly saw its own position shift. Both countries, once dependent on the American market, were forced to ask the same question. If Washington is no longer reliable, who can we turn to? And that's when Canada stepped into the picture. Canada had a new leader, Mark Carney. He wasn't a career politician, he was a former central banker, the man who had guided both Canada and Britain through global financial crises. Carney was not interested in dramatic outbursts, he played the long game. His first big move shocked critics. He lifted most of the retaliatory tariffs Canada had slapped on US goods. To some, it looked like weakness, but Carney explained it differently. Sometimes in hockey, you don't drop the gloves, you stay disciplined, avoid penalties, and focus on the win that matters. This was more than a metaphor. Carney wasn't giving in, he was keeping the door open, waiting for the perfect moment. But while the world was focused on his stance toward Washington, Carney was already looking elsewhere. And his gaze turned east toward India. For nearly a year, Canada and India had barely spoken. Ottawa had accused Indian agents of killings and extortion on Canadian soil. New Delhi had furiously denied it. Ambassadors were expelled. Trust had evaporated. Yet when Trump's tariffs hit, something changed. Canada quietly appointed Christopher Cooter, a seasoned diplomat with decades of experience in New Delhi, as its new High Commissioner to India. Days later, India responded by sending its own envoy to Ottawa. The timing was no coincidence. Both governments knew that with their economies under siege, they couldn't afford to remain enemies. This was about more than repairing old wounds, it was about survival. But survival wasn't enough. Both sides saw a chance to turn crisis into strategy. For India, the blow was devastating. In dusty factories and crowded markets, exporters faced ruin. Families who relied on garment and seafood industries suddenly found themselves on the edge of poverty. Economists warned that hundreds of thousands could lose their jobs. But the real danger came from geopolitics. Cut off by Washington, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to consider an option few thought possible: warming ties with China. Only 5 years earlier, soldiers from both countries had clashed brutally on their shared border. Yet Trump's tariffs left Modi little choice but to weigh a risky pivot eastward. Imagine the irony. America's attempt to punish India was now pushing it closer to Beijing. This is where Canada saw an opening. Carney understood that if Ottawa stepped in now, it could anchor India firmly to another democratic partner while weakening China's influence at the same time. Carney knew trade wars don't exist in isolation, they reshape entire alliances. His plan went beyond simply patching things up with India. At the G7 summit, he personally met with Prime Minister Modi. Behind closed doors, they discussed a strategy to bypass Washington's pressure. Canada would supply energy and raw materials. India would provide manufacturing and labor. Together, they could build a partnership strong enough to endure Trump's tariffs. This wasn't just an idea, it was a blueprint for a new world order. Canada, with its resources, and India, with its vast market, would form a relationship that didn't need Washington's approval. And it didn't stop there. Carney began rallying other middle powers, Japan, Australia, even parts of Europe. His goal wasn't confrontation, but diversification. Because in a world where America had become unpredictable, only those who built new alliances would survive. Trump's tariffs were supposed to make America stronger, bringing jobs back home. But the opposite was happening. Instead of isolating rivals, Washington was driving allies together. Canada, India, Japan, and Australia, all democracies once firmly aligned with the US, were now exploring their own networks of trade. Carney didn't hesitate to make the message clear. In a speech that cut like a blade, he declared, "The United States is not Canada, and Canada will never under any circumstances become America's 51st state." The words stung, but they also set the tone. Canada was no longer content to play Washington's junior partner. It was carving out its own path. And Carney wasn't just talking, he was reshaping Canada from the inside out. At home, Carney launched bold reforms. He abolished the federal carbon tax. He passed the One Canadian Economy Act, tearing down internal trade barriers that had divided provinces for decades. He pushed forward massive infrastructure projects designed to shield the economy from American shocks. Most striking of all, he pledged to raise defense spending first to NATO's 2% target, then to 5% by 2035. For the first time in modern history, Canada was preparing to stand alone if necessary. These moves weren't just about economics, they were about sovereignty. Carney was telling Canadians that their future would no longer depend on the whims of Washington. And across the ocean, India was arriving at the same conclusion. By the summer of 2025, the picture was clear. India and Canada, once distant partners, were now bound by necessity. The appointment of ambassadors wasn't just routine diplomacy. It was a sign that both sides recognized the global trade order was being rewritten. Together, they were forging a new kind of alliance, not driven by ideology, but by the hard reality that America's tariffs had made cooperation their best chance at survival. The lesson was stark. Trump's tariffs, meant to strengthen America, had instead fractured its alliances and created space for others to rise. And so the question now lingers not just in Ottawa or New Delhi, but in Washington itself. Did Trump just hand Canada and India the opportunity to rewrite the rules of global power?